Hello, everyone. I'm Kira,
And I'm Dan.
and we're your hosts for Distilled Church Finances Made Simple. Today, we're going to be talking about less math, more ministry, how to actually understand your church finances, part 2. But before we get into that, Dan, are you ready for the question of the day?
I don't think I can ever be ready, but let's.
Okay, so I spent some time really thinking about this one because Easter's coming up and it will have already passed by the time this episode airs. But I think the question still stands. If you had an Easter egg hunt entirely dedicated to your preferences, what would be inside of the Easter eggs, and also how would they be hidden?
Well, they would be hid in egg cartons on the counter, easy to get to with no looking around. No, I think actually, I'm training for a marathon. So I think what it would be is an Easter egg hunt along the route that I run, and you've got
That's
to
great.
grab stuff. And then probably if I'm running, it would be like water and, like energy gels and little things like that I would have. But if your question was really what's my favorite candy, I mean, it changes, but just chocolate and caramel with like either like a Milky Way kind of thing or like with peanut butter or what's the one with the 100-gram bar, something, the chocolate caramel thing. I don't know if it's caramel or caramel. I don't know. I probably said it both ways. Maybe we can look into that in an episode is what's the true
Yeah.
pronunciation of that.
So maybe that could be your final egg. Like you get all the different eggs
Nah,
along your running journey, but then like your winner's golden egg is like Milky Way's 100 grand, Reese's cups, just
yeah,
all in one.
and a Cadbury cream egg. Because it's
Yeah,
Easter, you got to have a Cadbury cream egg. I mean, but
100%.
yes.
Here. Okay, Dan, today we're talking about how to understand your church finances. A common thing we get from pastors is that they are overwhelmed by their financial reports. How do pastors better understand their finances?
Yeah, this is a great question. And there's a lot here, but what we want to do is just talk about some simple things. The problem is a lot of churches either they don't have an intentional chart of accounts, and don't worry about what that means in that phrase. But what that means is actually like there's all these accounts listed. And so money gets put into these. And sometimes it's like they just use the default out of QuickBooks and it's kind of business terms and it doesn't make sense to the church. Other times they've, added like pencils for classroom B of children's ministry. It's way too detailed on there. We're not going to talk about the cleanup side to it, but that's why it gets complex, is because there's so many numbers you can see and so much level of detail that you can get these long financial reports and you're like, I don't even know where to start. I don't know what these numbers mean. I don't know if they're good or bad. I don't understand why this number's what it is, any of that. So what we want to do is actually just talk about some simple numbers you can grab and use that no matter what level of your financials are in, you can take these numbers and say, okay, if I can track just these numbers over the course of time, I can actually understand a good deal of where my church is on a financial health scale. I'm not going to have all the details, but I'm going to start to know if something's tracking off. And so we're going to use 4 words. It's get, keep, have, and gave. Okay. So how much did you get? So you're looking at this for the month and how much money came in. Okay. We got this amount of money. Track that number. How much did we keep? So you got, well, let's just say we got 10,000 in and we spent 8,000. Well, we kept 2,000. Or we got 10,000 in, we spent 13,000. And so we kept negative 3,000, which means we overspent. So it's kind of the sum of your income minus your expenses. Where are we at with our keep? Okay. Then it's how much do we have? And so that's just looking at what's your cash on hand. And so that's just going to kind of follow the difference between what you had come in and what you spent and where are we doing. Now, I will say that I wish it was just as simple as I just said. Part of the reason it gets complex is there's accounting rules that make it more complex.
Right.
So that's why we like to check have, because it's also just a gauge. Are there other things that I'm not seeing in these first numbers, but that are impacting how much money we actually have in the bank? And then the last one is how many people gave. So what I like to do is just track those each month and track them on a sheet where I can see what's the trend over the last 13 months. If I'm looking at March of this year, look back to March of last year, and then the 12 months in between and say, what's the trend? How do I compare to the same month a year ago? What's the trend over the last 12 months? And start to see what patterns are. And again, like seeing the numbers helpful, but seeing it in context over the last several months
Right.
actually helps you understand, okay, where are we trending, and are we slightly moving up, or are we moving down? What are the changes? And that will start to give you indications of potential a problem. So, just even looking at like donors, if that starts to dip, that's probably a leading indicator that giving is going to start to dip. And so even tracking like what is happening there, okay, that you might have to look into it and get some help to dig into that potentially if you're not thinking financially. But with those four numbers, you start to get a really good pulse on what your church is doing and your overall finances.
That's awesome. And we actually have an episode where we deep dive on those core four
That's right.
in our distilled lineup. So we'll actually link to that in the show notes. But let's make this even more practical, Dan. I feel like we've started there and let's just keep going on the practical flow. What's a simple framework that pastors can use to know that they're financially healthy?
Yeah. So one of the questions we get commonly is like, how much money should I spend on this? How much money should go towards that? Right. So we're going to give you just some simple numbers and break it down this way: 90, 70, 10, 10, 10. Okay. So you're like, well, how does that work? They don't add to 100. Well, we'll just break that down. Okay. So the first is when you're thinking about, so that's in context of budgeting the 90. When you're thinking, so let me explain that. So when you're kind of projecting out your income, what you really should be thinking about is, okay, if we project $10,000 for a month, what we should do is kind of build our spending around 90% of that. Now, when you're in the actual, like your dollars coming in, you can still use it as a rule of thumb to say, are we spending about 90% of what we're giving, right? When we look at our keep number, in theory, that should be around 90% on average over time. And so, but what that means is it's margin, because you never know when you're projecting out your numbers, you're looking at it, like you don't know if there's going to be a dip in giving. There could be outside influences that impact it. Also, if you are spending every dollar and then God presents this other unique opportunity, you're like, oh, we really need to do it. Well, we can't afford it. But when you give yourself margin, it gives you, margin to spend on something that you didn't foresee before. It gives you opportunity to save for something that God's calling you to in the future. And so that 90% represents margin on your income. Okay, then the 70, 10, 10, 10, that breaks down into 10 to 70%. No more than that should be going into your staff in your building. And there's different stages for church where staff is higher or lower compared to the building. And, building usually is kind of like stair steps where it's these giant changes. But as your building costs go up, it's going to impact what you can afford on your staffing. But you really need to be no more than 70% between those two. In kind of that 60 to 70 range is what we typically see for healthy churches. And then the 10, 10, 10, it just breaks down into 10% kind of your operational overhead, 10% missions and so kind of like external missions, and then 10% for your internal ministries. Now, again, some of that ministry costs internal is staff and some of it's building. And so those numbers are broken up into there. We're kind of looking at the operational breakdown, not like the missional breakdown of your funding. But what we found is, the 70 towards your building and your staffing and the 10% to operations and administrative, those have to be your high. You want to get those lower. You need to make sure you're paying your people enough, but if you can get those lower, that's great because that gives you more money for missions and ministry. But where churches get those too high really puts the church off balance and they're not healthy financially.
Those are such good numbers. At first, when I was looking at it, I was like, Dan, do we know that this adds up to more than 100%? But I'm glad you scored that away for us. Really appreciate it. And the whole purpose behind this, right, is to ensure that as a pastor, fly over where everything's going, what buckets it fits in, so that when someone comes up to you and asks you questions, kind of what we talked about in our first episode, if you haven't listened, go back and listen to Dan's awesome story there. But when people ask questions, you can have that educated response of, yeah, this is what we're doing and this is how our money aligns with our mission. And that gives people the confidence to be generous because it's more than just spreadsheets. It's about those stories. I love it.
Yep, that's great.
Okay. Give it to me straight, Dan. What is one key takeaway that every pastor should take from this episode?
Yeah. So let me give you two. I know we say one, but they're easy. They're easy steps. So we talked about the core four, and we have a whole episode dedicated to that. So go and listen to the four numbers that every pastor needs to know. And even in the show notes from that one, you can get our template for a basic spreadsheet to do that. And then go read the article, What Are Healthy Church Budget Percentages, and just kind of understand those numbers a little bit more. And then you can kind of just compare your numbers in those categories and see how are we doing as a church? Are there places we need to make adjustments? These are rule of thumb numbers. There are reasons at times where but when we've analyzed and we work with hundreds of churches, we help tons of churches budget every year. These are common percentages. These are, and so, you just want to be intentional. But again, these are going to be really good numbers for you to gauge your church's financial health. And if you feel like you can't fund something or whatever, it might be because these are out of balance.
Well, Dan, thanks so much. This has been incredible. On to less math, more ministry, or for us, math in
Right.
ministry, right?
Exactly.
Have a good one, Dan.
You too.